I'm Dr. Timothy Schlairet. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist here at Thriveworks Counseling. Today, this fireside chat will be talking about trauma, the recovery from trauma, how trauma impacts our lives, and I'm going to get into a really detailed discussion of how we can really move on from trauma in our lives, try to make progress in terms of how trauma is affecting us. To start, I want to get into why trauma is important to me, where that passion comes from for me. I got my doctorate at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, later went on to internship and a postdoctoral fellowship in Veterans Affairs, and that fellowship focused on the treatment and assessment of trauma-related disorders. So for an entire year, I was working with really intelligent, hardworking people, really insightful people that helped me find a way to make sense of trauma. If we take a really broad view of what trauma is, it's this aberrant experience in our lives. It's something that is naturally very distressing, very uncomfortable, and it's difficult to make sense of typically. This is not to say that's the case for everyone, but for most traumatic experiences, it's difficult or impossible to predict it happening. And it's also difficult or impossible to predict how we're going to respond. If we look at the research on how people expect to respond in really distressing moments and really uncomfortable moments, we tend to have an expectation that we'll respond well, or that we won't respond in a way that we tend to see people typically respond. If we look at the research, we also know that we don't really have a way of predicting how people respond in these really distressing moments. To really find a way to make progress in terms of how trauma affects us, we need to process that event. We need to make it fit into a specific spot in our lives. We want to have a cohesive beginning, middle, and end for this event. And we want to find a way to see how it's impacted us, understand that, and incorporate that in our lives. We're not trying to make it a positive thing. We're not trying to avoid it. We're not trying to act as if it didn't happen. It becomes part of us, but we also make sure that we understand it. That's where my passion comes from. People explaining to me and helping me conceptualize trauma in my own way, and then really trying to help others conceptualize trauma in their own lives from what I've learned. My view of my role as a clinician, as a psychologist, is to really function as a teacher for a person. I want to help the individual get to that point where they understand what I'm trying to teach them. I want to be obsolete. I want to get to that point where they're the psychologist, they have the understanding, and they can tell me, hey, look, you no longer have a role here. I understand this. I can make sense of the experience in my life in my own way. And to do that, it takes, a different amount of work for different individuals. We're talking about the recovery process there, and the recovery process is not necessarily linear. Today's talk will get into trauma in terms of really trying to make sense of it, what the symptoms are, what they look like, how to identify those in ourselves, how others might see those in ourselves. We'll also move into some pretty specific structured treatments. There's 2 evidence-based treatments I'll talk about today, but that doesn't mean that's all there is. There are numerous types of treatment. All we care about is what works for you. I'll also touch on how we can incorporate some coping skills in our life. And if we're trying to put coping skills in, we want to have some really specific intention and a really great understanding. So those will be mixed in throughout our discussion.